When you live along the water, rising sea level gets your attention. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association finds millions of properties are at risk more than any other state. The city of Sarasota is launching a climate vulnerability assessment this year. Sarasota County's commission outlined policies to deal with sea level rise in its new comprehensive plan. And FEMA's updated flood maps go into effect starting Friday. And that means 28,000 more properties in the high-risk zones in this area. For more on these issues, we have three guests now. Futurist David Houle, Stevie Freeman-Montes, City of Sarasota Manager of Sustainability, and Darcy Young of the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Invitation.
Well, this sounds dire. I need to stay inside and make plans for the future real fast. Let's get some balance here. Start with you. How bad is this?
Well, you know, as a futurist, I always have been talking about how great the future is. But in the last 2 years, in writing this book, The Spaceship Earth, with Tim Rummage, who you featured in the earlier story, along with me, I became convinced that if we, humanity, didn't change, and we didn't profoundly change by 2030, that civilization may be out the window by 2100. Now, that sounds dire, but civilization as we know it. In terms of sea level rise, I think the simple, easiest thing that needs to be stated is that it is happening for two reasons. One, there is water on land in the form of glaciers that is melting. So there's fresh, new water coming into the oceans. At the same time, the oceans have been warming. 70% of the planet is covered by water. So in the last 35 years of documented global climate warming, the heat goes to the water, so the water's expanding. So the expansion of the water, at the same time you have new water coming in. And those two factors is what's triggering sea level rise.
Stevie, so far so good?
Yes. Well, I think it's important that we talk about it, you know, that we start these conversations about climate change and sea level rise, and the city of Sarasota is taking it seriously. We're trying to understand where we're vulnerable and look at it from a really technical space of looking at our infrastructure that's vulnerable to climate projections, to sea level rise, extreme heat, precipitation pattern changes, and how we can continue to provide public services into the future. So, so far we're so good, but we're definitely need to be resilient into the future. So we're trying to really take this seriously and also facilitate conversations that need to happen on this.
Some long-term projects you've got going there.
Yeah, it's job security.
Yeah, so Stevie, do you have others who work full-time for the city of Sarasota with the same kind of job mandate?
No, I'm the only sustainability manager in our sustainability program, but we do have an internal working group and an internal team that works on these issues, and a consultant team that's also helping us do our climate change vulnerability assessment. But as part of my job, when I was hired on in August or April of last year, part of my job evaluation that I'm evaluating on is how I'm helping the city prepare for climate change. So that's something that was very forthright in my job description and something I'm actually evaluated on.
Darcy, how do you weigh in on what David began with tonight?
I agree with David. You know, it's a dire situation, but I believe that we have the capability to plan for it, especially if we start now. So our job is to engage citizens, engage each other in talking about the issue. You know, at the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program, we take our responsibility for protection of Sarasota Bay really seriously. So we'll be looking at natural systems such as fish and wildlife and birds, and trying to think about how sea level rise might affect natural systems.
And just for some perspective, Sarasota Bay, what are the boundaries for that?
Sure. Our watershed extends from the northern end of Anna Maria Island down to the Venice Inlet.
Sometimes you think Sarasota Bay would just be around Marina Jack and the Ringling Museum, but it really goes miles and miles.
It does, and it also goes inland. So the watershed itself that contributes water to Sarasota Bay starts fairly far east and starts with the tributaries such as Philippi Creek, Hudson Bayou, and protecting those creeks is also important for protecting the health of the bay.
Okay, well, you're all on the record now. I've got some serious questions for you, but first let's take a quick break and come back and check the forecast and have more of our roundtable after this. Tonight we're discussing the impact of rising sea level on the Suncoast over the next 20 years. Our guests tonight are futurist David Houle, City of Sarasota's Stevie Freeman-Montes, and Darcy Young of the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program. So there's no debate, folks, that the sea levels are rising. Everyone agrees on that. The dispute is as to why it's happening. You'll talk to some who say perhaps it's the, and I'm not a scientist, I've done a lot of cramming this afternoon on this whole issue, frankly. Geothermal melting underneath the surface plays a part in this. The question is how much, and how much is it man-made causing the issues?
Well, that's the variability in all the various forecasts that we'll come up with. Because the glaciers are melting, which hasn't happened in the last 300 or 400 years, it's happened in the last 45 years, we just have measured the melt. But when it melts, it exposes the ground next to it. So instead of reflecting heat, it absorbs heat. So the heat in the land is now melting underneath the glaciers for the first time, rather than just melting off. There's always used to be some sunlight melt off the top of the glacier, but now that's been accelerated from underneath, so that whole bottom parts of glaciers are falling away.
We've been talking global warming now for, it seems, years. When did we first start becoming concerned with this? Well,
First Earth Day was 1970, and it is a historic pattern of ice ages through the last million years, and an ice age was supposed to happen in the 70s. So there's still some climate change deniers that say, well, you know, back in the 70s, it was supposed to be an ice age. But human activity and carbon into the atmosphere so overwhelmed the normal pattern of the planet that it really began in the 70s.
Well, I grew up in Buffalo in the 70s, and there was an ice age going on there.
Well, there's always an ice age going to Buffalo.
Stevie, do you want to say something?
Sure. Yeah, I think we're starting to talk about it more now because we're seeing more impacts now. I think people are very legitimately seeing the impacts in front of them. They're seeing the sea levels rise. They're seeing sunny day flooding at different parts of the state, for example. And so it's starting to raise our consciousness into more and more action.
And Darcy, one of your interests is the habitat restoration and protection of our fish and wildlife.
That's right.
Go ahead.
Sure. So habitat restoration is important for a number of reasons. You know, I think a lot of the reason that many of us live here is because we love the natural environment. We love going out on the bay, be it in a boat. We love fishing. But when you factor in sea level rise, it takes on a whole new dimension. Because if we are allowed to, if we restore habitat along coastlines, that gives habitats a chance to move inland as sea level rises.
Now, David, one of your favorite phrases is, what you can't see, you can't believe. And that's
right. Seeing is believing, right? That
old phrase. To get doubters to your side.
Right. And people can't see the fact that there is a quarter inch of a sea level rise per year. You can't see that.
And it doesn't sound that bad.
It doesn't sound that bad. But for every 6 inches of sea level rise, there's this 300-foot incursion. So to your early question, you know, I'm not trying to just promote the book, but this picture was taken in 1968. And prior to that, there was no history of anybody being able to see a picture of the whole Earth. And the minute we saw that, we realized that we're, as Carl Sagan said, the small pale dot in infinite space. So that's what started it all, when we realized we're on a spaceship and we're not getting resupplied.
Well, I also read today that there's an ice-free shipping lane now. Northern Canada,
yeah, right.
the Northwest Passage, there now is a clearance.
Exactly.
For
you don't need icebreakers anymore. Think about that. So, you know, it's like the Earth looked flat until we proved that it wasn't, right? And things are the way we think they are until we realize they're not. So if all the sea level rise were to happen in 2 years, it would be done. But over the next, I would say, I don't know what we're saying, Tim and I say 6 to 8 inches of sea level rise in Sarasota by 2030. And what's the estimate that you're working on from NOAA?
We're using the NOAA projections, which are about 2 to 6 inches by 2030.
Any comment?
Same from us.
Yeah.
As well.
Stevie, tell me more about the city of Sarasota. I'm still amazed that the city of Sarasota has somebody with your expertise on board.
They're great.
Okay.
Thanks for the plug, Dave. Thanks for the plug.
What exactly, where are tax dollars going? What exactly are you doing on this?
Sure. For this issue, so part of my position doesn't just look at climate change issues. You know, I definitely work on other topics around sustainability for the city. But within this project specifically, we're looking at our stormwater infrastructure, all of our pipes, all of our outlets. We're looking at our road elevations and roadways, and we're looking at our wastewater lift stations and water components. And we're overlaying sea level rise projections and heat projections and storm surge projections and prioritizing where we're most vulnerable so that we can make sure we can provide those services, you know, into the future. So we're doing this vulnerability assessment so we can start planning strategically, because it can take a lot of money and a lot of time to upgrade that infrastructure.
So Darcy, you talk about stewardship. What more can we do as citizens, do you think?
I think the first thing to do is to get involved. Whether you're someone who's very concerned about sea level rise or if you're not, I think it's important to talk to your neighbors and your family about the issue and how you think it will affect your children, your grandchildren. Talk to people like me who work at agencies that deal with the issue. Tell us what you're seeing in your own neighborhood. That's unbelievably important.
Now, David, you used a phrase tonight in our story earlier with Scott Dennis. You used a phrase, what will we do in our post-beach economy? You're not being an alarmist. You do think that by 2035...
2040 for sure.
2040 for sure, the Sun Coast won't have beaches as we do now?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So I love Sarasota, and I moved down here full time. I've been going back and forth because of futures and residence at Ringling, and I love this place. And so it's a cultural place. It's a wonderful place, but we have to plan for the future. What does a post-beach economy look like in 2040? And if something is inevitable, better face it. And I really want to do a shout out again to the city of Sarasota. Tim and I are connected with Ringling. Ringling is about design. Design is at the center of facing climate change. Sarasota is at high risk for sea level rise, and the state of Florida is the #1 state at risk for climate change. So to find out, as I've just the last couple of weeks with you and with Tom, that right here, in the front line of climate change, the city of Sarasota is doing so much. It's a much more evolved city than so many other cities. So we're proud to be a part of it and stand and work with them. They're doing great work.
When you heard in Scott's story earlier that places like St. Armand's Circle and Holmes Beach are going to be in jeopardy, perhaps, decades from now, let's not be alarmist. This is the opinion. Shouldn't some action be taken now to buffer some streets?
Well, that's what we're looking at. That's really the goal of why we're taking this seriously, to do the climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan, is to have those areas prioritized and actually create adaptation strategies for them. And so that's exactly what we're trying to do now within a year, and with a lot of public input, because there's a lot of input and options for the strategies to fix these problems, and there's a lot of trickle-down effects of those actions. And so we're trying to start that conversation so we can reach a consensus on how to solve the problems.
Now, Darcy, people are watching this right now and thinking, oh my gosh, they are really alarmists on this program, and I don't want it to come off that way. These are opinions or facts, or a little bit of both?
These are facts. These are facts about what's happening.
No question.
There's no question about it.
And for those who think that global warming is a invention of the liberal Democrats, you say what?
Well, I was just saying in the green room, it used to be in 2012, I get a lot of climate change deniers. When I give speeches, I don't. And I say to any climate change denier that's listening in today, if you really believe it, sit down with your grandchildren and tell them, Grandpa has something you want to never forget. Climate change is a hoax, and stand on your principles. But if you can't do that, then it's some political thing you're lost in. The facts are the facts. The last 16 months on this planet Earth are the warmest 16 months ever recorded.
And you think it's directly related to global warming?
Without question. In other words, carbon goes up into the atmosphere, and it stays there for centuries. And every single one of us, I don't think the three of us, but your viewers, every single individual is responsible for 16 tons of CO2 carbon emission every year. That's why you need to talk to people, get involved, so you can realize how you can dial down the impact you're having.
So you're somebody who wouldn't want to buy beachfront property, right?
Well, I had a story last couple of weeks that was on the news that was, on the front page of the paper. Good for them, the Sarasota Bradenton Realtors on their annual luncheon invited me to speak. And there's so many cash deals being made for beachfront property that I said to the realtors, I said, by 2020, there won't be a 15-year mortgage, there'll be a 10-year mortgage. But if it's a cash deal, when does it become fraud to sell beachfront property without full disclosure that the home may not be there in 20 years? There's no climate change law precedent. It's all going to be written going forward. So it's a lot. That's why I'm so excited to be in Sarasota, where these things are being thought about.
Where are you from, by the way?
I was born and raised in Chicago.
Gotcha.
So, you know, Buffalo I get. I went to Syracuse. I mean, I understand. I'm down here for good.
And Chicago has a couple baseball teams. I
Oh,
understand.
go Cubs. I mean, it's so surreal. The Cubs in the World Series, it's like no beaches in Sarasota.
I know it. Very similar. We'll take a quick break right now. When we come back, some final thoughts from our three guests. Stay with us. Welcome back. Scientists say rising sea levels are a reality we need to address, and our guests all agree tonight. Some final thoughts now. Start with Stevie, who worked for the city of Sarasota. Some final thoughts on this issue.
Sure. I would just like to recommend, anybody who really feels passionate about this and wants to get involved can definitely reach out to me or one of the many, many amazing nonprofit organizations that we have working on this issue, and to think about your own carbon footprint, your own impact to climate change, and how you can change maybe your transportation habits, the food you eat, the way you get your electricity, all those kind of major points in your own life, and how we can do better.
Tell us something that you do, and real quickly, that might be different than the mainstream along those lines. Do you ride your bike to work? Or?
I walk to work every day.
Do you really?
I do.
You don't live next door, though.
I'm able to, but that's a convenience for me, but I do.
Do you have one more thing you can tell us?
Not
put you on the spot.
I know.
You may step down now. Darcy,
I know.
go ahead.
Sure. I just encourage everyone to think about why they love living in Sarasota. Why do you live here? Don't be afraid of change. Think about how change might affect the way you live, and then think about how you can make changes in your life that will accommodate that change.
A couple of tips for us?
Sure. Tips would be, like I said, get involved, volunteer.
Very good. All right, David, you've got it.
I have tried in messaging to come up with an oversimplification. So when I wrote this book with Tim Rummage, we called it This Spaceship Earth. Marshall McLuhan wrote a quote that's on the front: "There are no passengers on Spaceship Earth, we're all crew." So we have to, this is the spaceship, it's not getting resupplied, and we're consuming 1.6 Earths of resources every year, so we're in the red zone. So we'd have to abort the mission if we don't start crewing the spaceship. So I think ask everybody to just think about, are you an unaware passenger or are you an aware crew member? And what are you doing to crew this spaceship? It's the only place we live.
Can't afford to have just passengers, can we?
Cannot, absolutely.
And you are a prolific writer. This is your 7th book?
This is my 7th book, book, and it's the one that's turned the corner. I've been very optimistic about the future, but this has shown me that climate change. Buckminster Fuller in 1970 wrote a book saying utopia or oblivion. In several decades, we would approach a fork in the road, utopia or oblivion. And after 2 years of research, I think climate change could be oblivion for civilization if we don't pay attention.
All right, David, Stevie, and Darcy.
That's a wonderful way to end. I'm sorry.
On that cheery note, thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to meet you all.
Appreciate it.